This is the 29th episode of Data for Future. At Data for Future, we believe in data-driven solutions to solve business challenges. If you're looking for data analytics, machine learning algorithm development, and web development, check out our service from our webpage and get in touch. Today, we have a very special guest, Marc Verbenkov. Marc has been a longtime friend of me and Pavlo. He actually inspired us to start the series of podcasts. Marc is a futuristic and technology consultant who looks into all the emerging technologies, including but not limited to robotics, VR, AI, automotive vehicles. Rather than the technology themselves, he's more interested in the long-term impact of the technologies on society as a whole, more specifically on employment situations. Any emerging technology, as we mentioned above, are very relevant fields of machine learning, AI, and data, because data is truly the fundamental that makes all the emerging technology possible. The podcast today is more like a snapshot of the casual dinner conversations that we usually carry on with Marc, because we're very fascinated by the topic and we want to bring it to the show to share with everyone. Hope you like it. So a brief introduction about Marc. Marc is futuristic and the host of the podcast Automated. And actually, it's a special guest because the whole reason I started a podcast was through a conversation where I talked with Marc and he was introducing his journey doing his own podcast. And the very first topic we talked about during our conversation was the emerging technologies such as AI, automation, vehicles, or virtual reality, how they are impacting the workforce for now and for the society in the long run. But among which we focus a lot on the topic of unemployment. We had this argument about if the emerging technologies such as AI will cause more unemployment on the way. And we had a pretty big disagreement. That was about a year ago when we had the conversation. So the first question first, Marc, have you changed your idea about technology and employment?
Well, first of all, thanks, Tammy, for inviting me onto the podcast. It's great to be here. I'm also glad that you were able to start and keep going with the podcast, which is not always with everybody. So congratulations on that. For your question, to respond to like whether AI will cause unemployment, right? There's really two different camps that you can fall into. And I may have been playing devil's advocate, but doing my own podcast for the last year or so has changed my thinking on it a little bit, or maybe not changed it, but maybe made it a little bit deeper, right? So in one camp, you can think of AI and I guess any other emerging technology that causes automation as creating something called technological unemployment. Mm-hmm. And it sounds very much like what the name means. It's where technology replaces the human employee, right? So it creates a job to become obsolete. A good example of this is like a horse carriage driver, right? It's something very visual that all of us can remember the pictures. There are no real horse carriage drivers anymore. I mean, they exist in like tourist attractions and things like that, but the car replaced horses in general, the horse carriage driver and many other people, right? So you would say that those people have been made obsolete due to technological unemployment. Now, the other argument is something called creative destruction, right? Or falls within the camp of that. And this is maybe where we were discussing the point on AI, right? Where new emerging technologies destroy, but then they also create, right? Of course, very similar to the term itself. So you have AI right now is part of the hype cycle. Many people are believing that it is kind of the last technology that humans need to create, and it will create tons of unemployment, if not all unemployment, for potentially all jobs that humans do, which, again, going back to our discussion, maybe that was a little bit hyperbolic, and I was taking that point of view in order to spur on the discussion. But yeah, through the podcast that I have myself, through the discussions that I've been having, and through the research that I've been doing, we are currently seeing now AI, to an extent, destroy some jobs, or at least transforming them. However, in the long run, there is, I don't want to be too hyperbolic, but there is a high percentage chance that many jobs will be automated. And we can get into the whys and into the what specifically later on. But if we want to kind of recap on that discussion, currently AI is destroying some jobs, but in the long run, it has a great potential to eliminate many different kinds of jobs.
Okay, so I think we are more or less reached to a closer agreement on that. But it's very interesting to note how your idea definitely evolved throughout the year when you work on your podcast, Automated, which, by the way, is a weekly interview podcast that interview people in the industry and whose work either is impacting or being impacted by the emerging of the technology. And I'm curious, what do you think was your biggest learning throughout all these interviews you've done and all the research preparation you've been doing? And are there some cases or discoveries that really changed your perception on this topic?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think for the most part, it's been just a deepening appreciation and understanding of these emerging technologies, right? One of the interesting technologies that I've personally been quite interested in over the last year is virtual reality. So I've had a lot of virtual reality CEOs come on. And one of the interesting things that I've learned from that is that, of course, it's an emerging technology and there's a lot of hype around it, especially a couple of years ago when the hype was kind of at its all-time peak. But now that the industry is getting or has been flooded with a lot of investment, there's a lot of new services, tools, and even products that have been built out over the last couple of years. And what this is leading to is kind of more potential to actually have new jobs being created in the VR space. Okay. Right. And maybe we'll talk a little bit later on in the episode, in the discussion here, but it's also been highly influenced because of COVID, right? Because we're all living in this socially distanced world now, or socially distanced era. VR, though it might not be fully utilized right now, many of the people that I've had on are definitely thinking that, maybe give it another 5-10 years and there will be maybe not full mass adoption, but there will be a greater amount of adoption of VR and use in it than previously believed. And I 1 year ago, if you had asked me about VR, I'd know a little bit about it, but I wouldn't have kind of the level of appreciation that I do now about what the potential future of it is.
Well, I think it's a very good time for you to share some of your appreciations, because my level of discovery about VR probably is where you were a year ago. And now talking about technologies, like any other hypes, we know the Gartner hype cycle, and I don't know where VR is lying for now. Maybe you have a better picture, and maybe give us some cases through why we see it as so potent.
Sure. Yeah. So from what I've understood from the discussions that I've had with some of the CEOs and some of the leaders in VR specifically, is that, there was this really high hype cycle for VR several years ago. I believe it was in 2013 that the Rift came out, which was kind of one of the first standalone headsets. This is just a headset that you can put on, and it created a lot of hype for the technology, for the industry. But then after a couple of years, after a lot of investment happened, there was that little investment boom in the VR stocks. I believe it was back then, maybe even just 5 years ago or so, where there was this peak euphoria, if I believe is the correct term, on the Gartner hype cycle. And since then, we've been in this trough of disillusionment at the bottom of the hype cycle. But it's only in the last year or so that company was bought by Facebook. I believe it was for some maybe $2 billion or something like that. You'll have to search for the exact numbers online. But it was really only the last year since their newest headset came out, the Oculus Quest, that brought on a lot of new interest into the industry. Mm-hmm. right? And the reason for that is because you don't need a cord for it. You can just walk around with a VR headset on your head and interact in this kind of digital virtual world, which is very different from before, where you kind of connected your head to the cord, which is connected to your computer. And, there's lots of potentials of knocking over your computer and having problems with a VR headset.
To me, I can almost imagine a scene where like you just need one key to open the door and then every possibility fill the room. This is the same with many emerging technologies, and that's why they're so fascinating. Like we don't know what's going to happen when certain technical barriers are overpassed. With VR is a great example. Personally, I have experience using VR in maybe when I go to an art gallery, we talk about this, like the exhibition when at the end, it's a very immersive experience. And we talk about using it in the laboratory to avoid the high costs and then to make it safer for students and it's more accessible for everyone. So among the many branches and impacts that technology can bring us, you focus more over the aspect of employment. And we can talk about AR or anything else. How do you think that will impact the workforce?
Yeah, sure thing. So, I mean, VR, it's going to impact a number of different parts of society over the next couple of years if these predictions stick to it. But specifically with employment, one of the big things that is going to impact is training. Right. So there's one specific use case which you might find interesting. There's a training center in Finland for truck drivers and bus drivers. So like large vehicle drivers. And there's only kind of one main center in all of Finland. And with a new government regulation, these truck and bus drivers had to renew their licenses through this training every single year. However, this one center only had, I can't remember the exact numbers, say 50 buses and 50 trucks. So it wasn't enough physical, tangible devices, right? In this case, buses and trucks, in order to train all of these drivers out there. So what they implemented was a VR training station, right? It was also a bit of a test because they didn't know whether the VR training would be as good as actually training on a truck. So there was a multi-year study that was done with this. And at the end, it was found that, a number of things. One, the amount of people that could be trained on it was, of course, vastly greater because all you need to do is put on a headset. You can have a couple little training sessions and then move on to the next thing. The resources that are saved are vast. You don't need to burn up any fossil fuels or even have a truck or a bus in that sense. And the third was that though it wasn't 100% as good as actually training on a truck, the results were comparable in the 90 percentile range, where somebody who had only been trained on a VR headset was then put in a truck or a bus at the end of that training session, and they were able to perform at about 90%, even in some cases a little bit higher, as somebody who had only been trained on a actual physical truck or bus. So the VR experience was, the technology now is good enough to enable that these training centers are good enough to replace the physical situation.
That in terms of employment, that actually enables more training. That means more people can come to the job. So that's the one case we're talking about where technology is creating more jobs for people. But meanwhile, are there cases that's going to the other direction?
Sure. Well, if we want to stick with VR, so it's a little bit of a double-edged sword, right? So yes, we see the trainings are enabling new people to perhaps come in. Even those drivers that I was explaining are able to keep their jobs. But you also have to look at kind of the entire industry, right? So if you have just VR headsets and no more training centers, then the people that are actually, typically setting up an entire workshop for the trainees, or the actual, experienced truck drivers who actually do the training for the people, those people might be losing jobs, right? So it's a little bit of job creation and job destruction each time that one of these emerging technologies come in. The I guess the ultimate question here, which hasn't been answered as far as I'm able to find out, is specifically within the VR training sector, is whether one is greater than the other, right? Whether more jobs will be destroyed or whether more jobs will be created. And this is, I think, something that like many different reports out there are starting to look into. It's a little bit harder for emerging technologies because there's not that much data about them. There's just not enough years of experience with these kinds of technologies out there. But with more stable technologies that have been there for some time, robots, for instance, then the data is a little bit more clear that more jobs are destroyed for every new like robot, for instance, that is implemented in different kind of companies.
For sure, like the balance is depending on the industry. We can never figure out a certain number, or the question will have an answer. But what fascinates me is, let's use the case you were talking about with the VR and truck driver training. I think to a certain scale, this kind of technology deployment only apply to maybe companies who can afford them. And sometimes if you're not at scale, the automation of certain tasks doesn't really make sense because the investment of the technology requires too much. And then people tend to cling back to using human force. In this transition, like I see this as a constant barrier where I don't see that automation will take many jobs very soon, because there are just so many areas, like cleaning the street it's a very tedious task, and you need to do your job, like no matter the weather, no matter the location. But if we imagine like a fully automated solution to clean the street for us, it's hard to imagine like who will invest money into this and make everything fully automated. So for me, certain job types, they're gonna at least survive for a very long time, and they're not gonna be impacted by the automation, even though they're the most basic and the jobs that need to be replaced the most.
Yep. Absolutely. I couldn't agree further with you. So I think you also hit on one of the key things here, which is the investment cost, right? Because a lot of these automation solutions, whether we're looking at robots, autonomous vehicles, AI, etc., are very pricey. You're absolutely right that certain businesses, even certain cities or even certain countries, couldn't afford a lot of the kind of full automation solutions that are available, right? So what you see is a lot of, kind of half solutions or part solutions. In the full-time work that I do, I also work on large collaborative European projects, and one of them has to do with collaborative robots, which is a robot arm that is able to sense when a human employee is around and slow down and stop, rather than the kind of traditional industrial robots that don't know that you're there and might even crush you or break an arm or something like that. So they have to be kind of enmeshed in a cage. The collaborative robots, which are an emerging technology, right? So they're not as, say, developed as the traditional robots. They are a little bit cheaper. So they are more easy to implement for, say, a small business, an SME, as we call it in the work that we do. So you have a cheaper solution that only partially automates certain things, right? So, but you're right. As things get more expensive, fewer solutions are available. However, once the technology improves to such an extent, once the costs of that technology are reduced, or once you reach economies of scale, when you're able to fully grow out your company, then those technologies are going to be cheaper. They're going to be able to be implemented in different places and in a wider, I guess you could say, at scale solutions.
Totally agree. Other than VR, which we've been talking quite a lot about, are there any other technologies that you think they're very promising, and there will, once we reach a point when the technology is advanced enough, we can see a huge impact?
Yeah, for sure. As we talked about at the beginning, AI is one of the main ones, and we can talk about it a little bit later on. But also, as we were talking about the kind of Gartner hype cycle, I would say that we're right, maybe not at the peak, but we're very close to the hype cycle of the autonomous vehicle market, for instance, right? So, nobody does it better than Elon Musk with Tesla, right, who I know that you're a fan of. So yeah, we're experiencing kind of almost weekly or even daily large news bits about the autonomous vehicle market. So there is a lot of promise there. There's also a lot of interest for investors because there have been some numbers that have come out recently saying that the Robo Taxi, this is obviously the autonomous taxis in cities across the world, could lead or could be a $1 trillion market. Just the taxis themselves. We're not talking about bus transport or boat transport or rail or long haul trucks or anything. It's just taxis, right? Just urban vehicles that could be a $1 trillion market. So there's tremendous hype surrounding this technology right now. However, this is one of the things that we were talking about in a previous discussion was that there's kind of real automation versus or hyped automation versus real automation, I could say. So the most of the press coverage of autonomous vehicles is focused around this Robo Taxi, right? The urban vehicle that can take you from your house to your job and back again, or from your house or from your work to your groceries and kind of anywhere in the city. That has gotten, I would say, 99% of the attention, if not more. However, it's only at, say, level 4, right? If maybe I can step back a bit. There's kind of 5 levels of autonomous vehicles. 0 being there's like no digital autonomous support, and level 5 is you don't even have a steering wheel or a gas or brake pedal. It's just you're a full passenger. Everybody's a passenger in the car, and the AI system in the car does everything for you. So we're only really at kind of the best solutions right now at level 4. Elon Musk, especially this year, has raised that hype cycle a little bit more by saying that Tesla Motors will have level 5 by the end of this year, right? In December of 2020. Very exciting if that actually happens. We'll see. Yeah. We'll see, right? But when it comes to other like actual implemented fully autonomous transportation solutions, there's already many examples out there. So we have fully autonomous trains, right? Because they're relatively simple. It goes along one track and you only need somebody to either slow down or stop the vehicle, or I guess then start it up again. So the amount of kind of situations that a train can come into is vastly less complicated than a vehicle in a city, which is why there are numerous fully autonomous, like level 5 autonomous trains out there, also for metro cars or the subway and things like that. I lived in Toulouse a number of years ago, I think even some 7 years ago, and they already had fully autonomous metro stations throughout the whole city. Right, so there are a number of these technologies that have been implemented. Same thing for autonomous ships, right? This hardly ever gets any news coverage, but we have a number of autonomous ships already traversing the English Channel for goods. I don't know if they've been used for passengers lately, but definitely for goods, and also for planes, right? Because you're not likely to crash into another plane when you're in the skies because the skies are so big and so clear. We do have level 5 autonomous planes, and that's now actually being moved into the military. But that's a whole other discussion for another time, maybe. So yeah, if I can just summarize it quickly, we have kind of the hyped level of automation, which typically gets the most amount of press coverage because it's exciting, it's going to impact more people's lives, but it's maybe a fair amount of time off. Like autonomous vehicles could be, a decade or 2 decades away before they're fully implemented. Whereas we have kind of the real autonomous solutions that are already in place, which rarely get any news coverage, but they're already there, sure. which is kind of an interesting juxtaposition between the two.
Well, definitely it's very exciting to foresee all those technology development and how they can really bring difference to our day-to-day life. Meanwhile, I'm sure people also express different concerns toward these emerging technologies, not only in terms of employment, because if there's automated vehicle, means drivers are gonna be gone, and there is a more automated plane, that means the cost is going to be lower and people is going to be easier to travel. However, we also need to think about if there is more planes flying in the sky, we are closer to the 1.5 degree allowance. So What are some concepts that you think people are the top concerns together with the technology?
Yeah, certainly. So, of course, I like talking about unemployment concerns, job concerns. But there are two other kind of really interesting concerns, I think, that don't really get talked about too much. So one is cybersecurity, right? So when you have a automated vehicle, for instance, it's significantly easier to automate an automated vehicle than it is, say, a 1950s vehicle, which has no, digital parts in it.
Sure. Yeah.
Right. So you can then extrapolate that to all different parts of society or civilization, if you even want to go a little bit bigger. You can have fully automated manufacturing plants, right? Okay. So there are fewer humans, if not no humans, in there. It's easier to hack into a robot than it is to hack into a human, right? Mm-hmm. Same thing for logistics. Maybe you've seen there was a viral video a couple of years ago. It was with the Amazon warehouse vehicles. I don't know if you've seen the little orange. They're called autonomous guided vehicles. So they just very simple. They lift up boxes, they move them around, but they're in something called a dark warehouse, right? So you don't need lights on anymore because there's no human workers in there, but it's just thousands of robots moving, working, collaborating in order to move the goods that you and I enjoy from Amazon. So yeah, hacking is a big concern. I think there are also a number of different prizes out there from a number of these companies that are bringing about these autonomous solutions. Again, most notably, Tesla had I think it was a $100,000, if not $1 million prize several years ago for anybody that could hack one of their vehicle models, right? Sure. It didn't happen, so they're kind of robust in the hacking sense, but that's one of the industry leaders, right? Mm-hmm. We're definitely going to have problems as time goes on, as more of these autonomous technologies are implemented with hacking concerns. Mm-hmm. But those are, I would say, smaller, localized problems. Yeah. Right? You could probably hack, one vehicle. You can probably hack one robot, but it would be significantly more challenging to hack an entire warehouse or an entire autonomous fleet. The kind of more systemic problem actually came from an article, and I have it written down here because I think it's really interesting for people. I recommend you to have it in the show notes, but it's also for people that want to listen to it. It's by James P. Crutchfield in a 2009 article, The Hidden Fragility of Complex Systems. So very, very interesting article. It's not too long. I recommend anybody who's interested in this to look into it. As I said, it was written in 2009, and he was talking about the transportation system across the globe becoming more interconnected, becoming more complex, becoming more interdependent. And because of that, it becomes more fragile at a systemic level, right? So many people have said he's a little bit of a prophet because he actually uses a virus hitchhiking on transportation systems that could eventually lead to a global pandemic. Right. So many people are saying, okay, well, he was, I think at the time he was talking about the H1N1 virus, but it's much more relevant for today's, COVID situation. So I think the interesting and relevant point here is that, this article talks about as systems become more interdependent, they become more linked, they become more of a system. It's much easier for the entire system to collapse rather than one small isolated aspect of the system to collapse, which then can be repaired or replaced. So we're really looking at, as we move forward into a kind of an automated future, a bigger kind of systemic collapse or systemic risk rather than these smaller changes.
Yes, very interesting for the side of cybersecurity, for sure. It's something especially the big tech companies start to pay a lot of attention and investment into, because the potential disaster is just purely out of imagination. If we look at the budget for the US Army versus for education, we see like to defense, you need to invest so much more and to think about so much more. And on the other side, I really like the idea you shared about the system fragility when it's getting complicated. That's also another question I wanted to ask you about. As we go into more advanced technology, more automation, it's super exciting. We can just maybe there's a tool so easy to use. There are 2 buttons and we can achieve whatever we want. Maybe we can just think in our head and the things will happen. But we reach to a point where we really don't understand the very basic about how things work. And I think we as a society are rising higher and higher from the ground of the knowledge level. The other day we were having a conversation with our friend who talked about nowadays we don't need to remember any knowledge because Google is at our fingertip. Whatever we don't know, we just Google. We need to learn how to search, how to find the answer, using tools built by other people rather than find it ourselves. Do you see that do you have some thoughts on that in terms of how the development of technology is balancing with how people really learn and understand and interact?
Yeah, absolutely. This is actually a really interesting topic. So I've had multiple debates or conversations on this topic over the years, especially with people that are at a different generation, right? A little bit older. This seems to be a trend that there's always this idea that the newer generations are getting ruined, right? Because of new technologies. Our generation, it's cell phone use, right? We're losing, as you said, our ability to think, our ability to calculate, right? Our ability to think in the ways in which previous generations attributed value to. And from what I've been reading over the last few years, this is not a new trend. This is not going to go away, right? If in the next couple decades, if we have children, we are going to be critiquing them and their generation about the things that we value, right? Probably a good, deep, interesting conversation is something that we value now that might not be relevant in 20, 40 years time from now. One of the things that I think is interesting is, we are potentially losing some skills, some characteristics that previous generations valued, but then we're also gaining new ones, right? Like, as you said, our ability to search anything on Google. Impossible to think of 20 years ago for our parents' generation. However, we are losing the ability to maybe retain that information, as you were saying. So essentially, what does this conversation come down to? It comes down to, what do you attribute value to? What does society attribute value to? And then how do you argue to people that think, okay, it's really important to retain knowledge in your own personal brain, right? Rather than having it stored on the collective brain. You can make that argument because it was valuable 20 years ago. I would still argue that it's still valuable to retain information in your own mind, but as the searching capabilities becomes easier and easier, and as it becomes less important to retain information because searches become so easy, that argument starts to dwindle. It starts to fade a little bit. And I think this is the same argument for any other skill that we see that we value now. We value it because we're young, because we're ambitious, because we're using our skills in the world. I do think that give it another 40, 50 years, we will probably be holding on to the vast majority of those skills and valuing them still, while society has moved on to other skills that we don't necessarily value because they are different and foreign to us. And I think this is kind of the generational argument that comes all the time. And the last thing I'll say on this, right? The same argument was being done by our ancestors when the first spear was invented, right? Like how dare you use that spear? You're going to lose your ability to run. Right? This is the same argument that comes up over and over. And I think is an interesting one, but I also think that it's one that's going to continue for all time of humanity.
Sure. And that's a reflection about how the almost day-to-day and seemingly change is really in the long term changing our lifestyle, our physical, our mental. Something very interesting to see is people who are very top of the trend of technology development, people who, let's say, programmers, data scientists, or people who sit in the office in front of a computer every day, they're very likely to be the group who is spending a lot of time isolated in nature. They want to be fully detached. Like on the one side, they embrace everything, they work with it, and then they take advantage of whatever they have. On the other side, they want to stay as far away as from it. I think there's this conflict and dilemma in between that is really difficult to find a balance. Meanwhile, we talk about how the change has been pretty smooth and subtle between generation pass on. We just see, okay, now I talk with my ancestor. Okay, we have very distinct views about what is valuable skills. But on the other hand, right now, in the middle of the pandemic, we see how COVID is taking our lifestyle into a sharp turn. And it's impacting many people's jobs, lifestyle. And maybe we can also touch upon on that. What's your idea?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're going to have different points of view with every single person because this entire, last 9 months or so has impacted everybody so differently. I mean, personally, I've been quite fatigued with the amount of Zoom calls and Skype calls and GoToMeetings that I've been having with my own work as well as with the podcast that I do. But at the same time, I'm so grateful that I have these tools at my fingertips to be able to connect with people kind of all over the world with family, right? I'm from Canada. The majority of my family does not live in Europe. So we still all connect with a Skype call every week. So there's vast benefits of having these tools. And I think that, going to your question with how has COVID potentially changed some of these things, it's just fast forwarded our use of them, right? So to maybe connect it back to one of the first things that we were talking about, the VR industry in particular is getting a substantial boost from the COVID situation because people are really looking for that immersive connection, right? I'm sure with your work as well, you probably have a ton of Zoom calls. And it's quite a, inhuman way of connecting with people. You probably have like some lag or some person's face can freeze in some awkward facial situation. It's not a great way to connect. It's also just 2D. So this emergence of VR, which enables, okay, it's not perfect. It's still a little bit cartoony if you have a digital avatar, but you're still able to interact with somebody more or less as if they were there in front of you. Again, with a digital avatar, but it's still pretty good. Which enables this sense of connection and immersion that all of us have always been wanting in, say, business meetings or other situations, right? We crave this face-to-face meeting, and VR, for instance, is enabling that. Whereas Zoom, Skype, these other kind of apps enable the, I'd say, like very basic level of connection, which is still important.
Sure thing. One interesting thing I like to think about is, down the road, maybe one day, in terms of religion, nationality, we talk about, okay, do you use the product from Apple or Google, or you use Alexa or Apple Pod in your house? I see nowadays we grow more and more reliant with those service providers who enable the basic day-to-day working life, communication between friends, how we are social and entertain ourselves. But on the other side is really creating this distance and polarization of the society. And talking about unemployment, people who take the trend, change their skill set, constantly learn, can maybe take advantage of it and then stay on top of the game and be benefit from this change and cycle. However, there are also people who are not willing to or unable to fit the trend of the society. They're not digital, they don't like it, they don't have the knowledge resource to think about that. And then those people, we think, are eventually going to be the people who drop into the unemployment pool. maybe they will engage in more jobs like service, entertainment, art, which I don't think will be replaced by robots as much in the future. But meanwhile, what should those people do?
Yeah, that's a bit of a sad and complicated question simultaneously. So, I think you really hit the nail on the head here. But this has also happened in all transitions in the past, right? So I used the example of, the horse buggy versus the car, right? That's kind of one of the more recent in the last 100 years. That was a significant transformation, right? You had many people completely out of work. Their life skills were no longer useful on the market. But then you also had other people that transformed their business, their skills to make use and value for the new emerging car market, right? Many of the the large car suppliers or part suppliers, I should say, actually used to be carriage suppliers, right? They've evolved over the last 100 years. So there is, of course, this capacity to survive these transitions. But more to your point about those people that can't necessarily do that. Maybe one other thing that's quite interesting is that things are a little bit different from back in the horse and buggy days, right? Things move a lot faster. So even if some people are, they have the desire to, as you said, continuously learn, take on new skills, get new education to become relevant to the job market, they might not be able to simply because things are moving too quickly, or because now you need to be hyper specialized on something in order to become successful at it, right? And it just takes too long. You might just be too old. This kind of goes to a partial answer to that anyways, is it goes to some different kind of regulations or policies, I should say, that are starting to creep up, especially now with the COVID situation. The most famous or well-known out there is, of course, universal basic income, right? So this is something that has been around for decades. It's been talked about by both sides of the aisle, both left and right. However, we are now seeing, specifically because of COVID, because many people used to think, it's going to be automation that's going to bring about a universal basic income because jobs are going to be erased. But no, it's a tiny little virus, a little microscopic virus that has forced everybody into lockdown, into shutting down their business, right? An enforced shutdown of your business. You essentially are being made obsolete simply because of new government regulation and policies. So because of that, we now have, of course, a lot of stimulus plans across Europe and across America and most of the world. And there's a new resurgence of this idea of universal basic income. It has, as I said, it's been around for decades. One of the earliest full pilot studies of this was actually done in Canada, in a province called Manitoba, which not too many people know of, but this was already in the 70s, so some 50 years ago. It was an entire community that was given between $1.5 to $2,000 Canadian dollars per month, fixed for inflation, and they were given it for, I believe, 3 to 4 years, right? So it wasn't just a 6-month period; it was a considerable amount of time. Of course, then the government in Canada shifted. It was a little bit more of the conservative government, and they shut down the project. But sociologists and anthropologists since then have been looking at that one study because it was one of the longest and it was one of the first. And what they find is that a lot of socially aberrant behaviors, crime, violence, drug use, pregnancy, unwanted pregnancies, teenage pregnancies, etc., were drastically reduced in the community that had this universal basic income implemented over the 3 years. So I don't want to just say this only happened in Canada, because some people might think, it's just in Canada, but not specifically this pilot site, but many different other forms of universal basic income have been piloted across the world. There's an example of Alaska, right? They have this oil dividend. Every citizen in Alaska gets, I can't remember the exact number, a couple hundred, or if it's like $1,000 or $2,000 per year, simply because they live in Alaska. It's not universal basic income per se, but it's part of it. But I think most interestingly, you have examples in places where money can really go far. So there are numerous cases in India where you have entire, not just a community, but entire smaller towns are given a form of universal basic income, right? They're given enough support where they have enough money to satisfy their means for a considerable amount of time, 2 years, 3 years sometimes. And then they're able to be measured against, another town as a control group, right, where more or less the rates of violence and crime, et cetera, were the same before. And again, we see the same sort of thing. We get a lot of these aberrant social behaviors decreased when universal basic income is implemented there. But I think the more interesting part here is that you see something a little bit different, and that's you have new higher levels of entrepreneurism. Right. So you have people who have their basic necessities taken care of, and they know, I think this is also a key point, they know that it will be taken care of for the considerable future. So it's not like a 6-month project. You hoard that money in fear of the day that this project is done. No, there's this continuity with the projects. So as I said, you have these communities where they feel at ease for some of them the first time ever, right? If they're like a small farming community or small farming town, they're kind of at the risk of different weather patterns. But now it doesn't really matter what the weather does. They have enough money to do what it is they need to do to survive. So they're able to take on new water purification businesses, or new kind of seed planting businesses, or all these interesting kinds of entrepreneurial ventures that you wouldn't find without universal basic income in that sense.
Well, when we are looking toward the future and talking about unemployment, universal basic income is usually stick out as one of the best solutions. However, as you introduced it, it seems very promising through the research, examples, and the tests. But are there any drawbacks of it? Like, wouldn't people just be lazy and do nothing, and then people abuse the money? How can the system really be balanced and fair if certain people really work very hard and the money and wealth they generate, why they should be distributed to other people? Like, what are some concerns behind?
Yeah, I think you touched on some of the main concerns there. So I think this is also why universal basic income was always closely tied to automation, right? Because if you have a significant percentage of the population that it's not that they don't want to do something, it's just that they can't, right? Because there's just too much automation, that there aren't enough jobs, then what are these people going to do, right? It doesn't matter how ambitious you are, which is the real fear for the kind of the far future. No matter how ambitious you are, there's no job for you to do. This is why universal basic income was kind of always used by the futurists out there that talk about this as a potential solution, or at least partial solution. But no, you're right. There are significant drawbacks to universal basic income. One of the first ones is that it's very often not universal, right? It is only in part. It's very expensive, right? So the actual opportunity to have it for an entire Western, industrialized country, probably not going to happen unless you cut back on a lot of other social support schemes, right. Which is there's this big argument, especially in America, where Andrew Yang was explaining. As he was running for president, he was arguing like, no, you can have both. You can have the support services that are needed as well as universal basic income. So it was much more of a math argument there. But in other places in the world, that might not be the case, right? There could be cuts to certain social safety nets in order to bring about universal basic income. One of the other things, which you did touch on, right? The laziness argument, right? If people are just given money, what's going to happen? They're just going to, sit on the couch all day and watch TV. This, I would argue, is actually a bit of a myth, right? So in all of the universal basic income pilots that we've seen, in all of the tests, there is, of course, a percentage of people that do that, but it's typically much lower than expected. We're talking like 1% or lower. Typically, people want to do something with their lives, even when they have the money to take care of themselves and they don't need to work. One of the things that was found in a number of these studies across the world, so this is irrespective of the culture, you have a number of people having universal basic income and then going out and getting a job, right? So not just becoming an entrepreneur, but getting a job or keeping their job because they appreciate the social connections. They appreciate, the sense of value, the sense of contributing to a company, or maybe they're working for an NGO and they appreciate something like that. So there are problems with universal basic income, but there are also a lot of these kind of myths that are connected to it. And maybe the last thing that I'll say, which is kind of more my personal critique of universal basic income, is the fear that a population will become very much dependent on the government that hands it out. Right. Yeah, that's a significant concern, especially depending on which country you're living in, right? You come from China, there's lots of human rights abuses and issues with the government over there. That's not what we're seeing in totality in the West yet, but what were to happen if a government were to have more or less control of a population through doling out this cash, right? They would be much more able to get away with things because the population would become dependent on them. So I'm not a pessimistic kind of person. I don't like those kind of even conspiracy ideas out there, but there are things that are brought up in the discussion surrounding universal basic income.
I think the point about how we will grow more reliant on the government is very solid. But is that the problem only for those who rely on universal basic income? Because if you are in the league where you create solutions, technology, and you sell them, you generate enough wealth, you're the one who is the government relying on you in that case. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I would say that you could go one step further, saying that the government would then be relying on the automation technologies that those entrepreneurs or leaders of industry are relying upon, right? But no, you're right. The population that receives these cash dividends would become reliant on the government, and the government would then, in essence, rely on the people that are actually doing the creation, doing the work. So which is why I'm a little bit critical of universal basic income. If I can throw in my own personal opinion here, I don't like the idea of people becoming dependent on a system. I prefer, the kind of ambitious nature, which we've talked about previously off air. It just feels better to be an ambitious person that creates something yourself. The argument for universal basic income for the last 50 years has been when we eventually reach to a more like fully automated society, then the kind of question of ambition or entrepreneurialism is a little bit moot, because there will be such a high level of automation that many people won't be able even to create jobs in that sense.
Sure. Well, okay, very thought-provoking. I would say, just to link it back a bit to the podcast, like what we focus on data and sustainability. Why do we talk so much about automation and the technology? It's because really data is underlining in every technology advancement we're talking about. Be it AI, machine learning is very obvious, or the automated vehicles or the robots. Yeah, it's like everything is empowered by data, even with the idea of when we are accessing policies such as universal basic income. We need the data to power through to make the decisions. But meanwhile, it's also very important we get it right, because when we are collecting the data, we are using our logic to train and develop the machine in most cases nowadays. And it's very limited to the people who develop the tools. So how we can develop tools that help us, but also be like justified, is also something we need to pay attention to. Well, meanwhile, just coming back to when we talk about is the people about universal income, when there are certain people who rely on the government for getting support, and the government rely on the big companies. And what I see is really the polarization where big companies in the future, they have a say about everything. And maybe this is not toward when we're looking into the future, but many of the peers around me, they have this thought about how we should stop using the service provided by the big companies because yes, they're free, yes, they're convenient, but when the product is free, you're the product because you are donating or your data, your information to help them to develop more monopoly. Mm-hmm. What's your take on that?
I think we had, one of the many discussions that we've had was about this, right? Typically spurned on by the social dilemma, that documentary. So, my speciality is not data. So my understanding is a little bit limited, but yeah, I would definitely say that these, I think, as you said quite well, right? These services, these platforms, they provide a service to us. But in doing so, we become the product, right? And I think one of the things that's very clearly outlined by that documentary, but also I would also highly recommend to any people listening, go and check out Jaron Lanier. He gives some terrific keynote speeches. He's the father of VR. He's written a number of books of like why you should delete your social media accounts, etc. It's really about the changing kind of cognitive abilities or cognitive capacities of people as we're using these programs, these platforms like Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, etc. The way in which, as you said, we become the product is not to the benefit of the individual. So one of the maybe the concerning things for me is that the amounts of suicide or self-harm or depression is actually on the rise. And it's very, very clearly connected to the times when Facebook came out or started being used by younger teens, or when you have these like new updates, for instance, right? You can have a much more addictive platform in order to get your time, which is exchanged for advertising revenue for these platforms as their basic business model. But it does nothing to actually serve the individual themselves. So rather than connecting us, we are becoming a little bit more polarized as well, which is another thing that these platforms do by showing you something that is constantly of interest to you, or predicted to be of interest to you. Right. It creates these filter bubbles, right? So rather than me seeing, if we go into politics, right, the left and the right position on a certain topic, if my search history is showing, I'm much more likely to look at things on the left, then the AI algorithm would be showing me more and more things that are extreme on the left, which does nothing but create a more polarized society.
Absolutely. Like by surrendering ourselves to the convenience and the social tool we are using right now, we are also making really the software engineers, whoever is behind the product, our god. They decide the logic. They decide, okay, if you see this, that means you're interested in this, and that means I need to recommend that to you. And they design the logic around your life. However, as individual and users, we also need to be more aware and just start to think more about why this is appearing on my social feed. Like we talk about in the documentary Social Dilemma, they depict it really well. So definitely a recommendation for whoever haven't seen it. But very interesting conversation, Marc. I feel we touched a lot upon the future of technology. It's a very broad topic, and we touched really many aspects. It's interesting to see your understanding as you developed after like looking into this specific topic for so long, and touched on many specific use cases. Are there any other thing you'd like to share?
Yeah, for sure. I think, so we had talked a little bit about what we were going to talk about on the podcast before. And I think maybe it's kind of a final thing. I want to leave the audience with maybe a little bit more of a tangible action that they can do, right? If you have maybe a younger audience who are still in school and they're looking, what are some of the skills that I could potentially have? What are some of the actions that I can do, whether it's in education or otherwise, to be still relevant for the future, right? I mean, there are tons of reports out there. There are tons of books. There are tons of podcasts that touch on the subject. It can get really quite complicated quite quickly. For those of you that are interested, I will share the links after with you, Tammy. But there's a really good series of reports from a well-known organization called the Mckinsey Global Institute. Right? They're well known. And in this series of 5 reports, they do touch on like what is the potential of automation, and then what are the kind of skills that will be impacted. So I do have a little quote here that I think would be relevant to kind of maybe summarize this as well as end the podcast on. But so this comes from one of the reports, and it talks about the activities that are most susceptible to automation. And these are the physical ones in highly structured and predictable environments, as well as data collection and processing, right? So it's data is interesting, but if you're involved in the processing or collection of it, you might want to think elsewhere. This is, of course, taken from the United States, which has a really easy access to the statistics of employment figures over there. Also, it's interesting to note that these activities, right, the physical ones that I just mentioned, make up 51% of all activities in the economy. So we're not talking about a small percentage. We're talking about more than half of all activities in the next 10 to 20 years will be automated in some way or another. Whether they're actually automated, whether the company takes on the technology to do so is another question, but they're actually capable of doing so. And for those of you that are maybe working in these sectors, the places where these are most prevalent in is manufacturing, automation in food services, and retail trade. And I think the interesting thing is that it's not just like low skill job types that maybe we talked about before, but it's also middle skill and even high paying, high skill occupations that have this potential to be automated, which I think is, anyways, for me, I can say when I first heard about that was very interesting, because I always thought it was, the low level, the low skill type jobs. My first job ever was working at McDonald's, for instance, right? I was a line cook. It was very, very repetitive, very easy to be automated. But it's definitely different things now with the different kind of technologies that we have out there. The last thing here that I will touch on are the specific skills, right? So that's more about the jobs, the occupations in total. The specific skills also comes from these reports. So if you're a worker and you're thinking about the kind of future, think about this. The workers of the future will spend more time on activities that machines are less capable of, right? Rather obvious. But these are broken down into activities such as managing people, applying expertise, and communicating with others, right? Much more of these human kind of social interactions. So we will be spending less time on predictable physical activities and on collecting and processing data as before, where machines already exceed human performances. So really the last thing I want to say on this is that the skills and capabilities required will also shift, requiring more social and emotional skills, and more advanced cognitive capabilities such as logic, reasoning, and creativity. So maybe it's kind of one of the final things that really, when I heard this, it really kind of sparked my imagination and made me think about like what the future of work will be like. Typically in the medical establishment, we have the hierarchy where doctors are at the top and nurses are below them, right? However, if you believe in these reports, if you think that there's some sort of validity to all these things that are coming out, that might be inversed or flipped over the next while, right? Because if doctors, especially diagnosticians, are just simply spending 7+ years of school to repeat certain facts into their mind that they can then see, visualize, and communicate it to somebody. Whereas maybe in the future, an AI system would be able to do that in a split second. But the real activity that would be done there would be the communicating of, say a cancer diagnosis or something else to somebody else. And in that sense, the nurses would be much more relevant than the doctors themselves. So that's just one example. This is applicable to many different industries across the world, but I thought that was relevant for the podcast.
I really like your closing thought, because personally,
I don't say it every day, but I'm sure everyone is thinking about, okay, where should I be in the future? Like, where should I position myself? There's so much uncertainty, and what should I do to get to where I want to be? Personally, I learned data, I believe, is the future, but still there's constantly questioning. And be it you want to be in the league where you follow the technology trend to enable the change, or you can be on the other side. Like you said, like being a nurse doesn't mean is inferior than being a doctor. There's no hierarchy. In fact, in the future, when we are talking about automation, the occupations that's most worth automating is those very specific expertise jobs, because they're high paid, so it's worth the investment to start with. And then like machines doing operations, they're more precise even. However, on the other side, let's say a nurse or a teacher for a school that's caring about the kids, because they're very human and they need a lot of interaction and unpredictability. Those are actually the field where we'll see people will dedicate more time into one day. Through reading the book of Artificial Intelligence by Kai-Fu Lee, he mentioned how in the future we foresee a society where we have majority elder population, and as a society we're trying to be very smart and use artificial intelligence to help them to live a better life. And they develop really intricate futuristic paths that can basically fill any need the elder people need. They can say to the pad, touch a button, and have different entertainment. However, people never use it. And after the research and development, they tried so hard. I don't understand why they don't design too well. But the thing is that the older people, they simply don't want to talk with a pet. They want a real person. So they will pretend they don't know how to use a tool. They will break it, but because they want real human interaction. So it comes to the very basic, like being creative, interpersonal skills, communication, and to build a real true connection. I think those are some valuable skills and assets we should take in. So talking about technology, but it all comes back to interpersonal and day-to-day life.
Yeah, the human aspect. I mean, as much as I love technology, automation, my eventual hope is that a lot of these tools, these technologies in place will allow a much more kind of human and interconnected society than we have now. I really hope that we're just kind of going through a transformational period where we're sensing a little bit more disconnect between individuals through the use of cell phones and maybe these apps and platforms that we talked about. But a fully automated future, right? If we look, far into the future, is one that I would hope just takes care of these kind of mundane tasks to enable a much more rich, vibrant, interconnected society.
Very nice closing note, Marc. Last question. If people want to reach out to you and get to talk more about the topic about automation, employment, how should they get in touch?
Yeah, for sure. So you can, of course, check out my podcast, automatedpodcast.org. As Tammy said at the beginning, it's a weekly interview podcast where I talk to CEOs and leaders in multiple different industries, but always try to touch on automation and how it's impacting jobs. I'm also active on LinkedIn, so you can just find me, Marc Verbenkov. Send me a message, like some of the stuff that I send out. Happy to connect.
Okay, thank you very much, Marc. That concludes our episode for today. Data for Future. We'll see you next time.
Great.
Great.
Woo! An hour long.
Very nice.